Today we're going to discuss the formation of the euro and how it contributed to the sovereign debt crisis that is now ravaging Europe and the rest of the global economy. Now, the idea of a currency union in Europe is an idea that's been around for several decades and was proposed by political leaders and economists such as Winston Churchill and John Stuart Locke. Now, the idea of a single currency in Europe was not just to create a monetary union between European nations, but a political one as well. It attempted to draw European nations together to form, perhaps in the future, a single government. Winston Churchill even discussed the idea of the United Nations of Europe in one of his more famous speeches. Now, this idea came to fruition in 1999 when 12 European nations gathered to form the Maastricht Treaty. Now, this treaty was the groundwork of the euro. The most important aspect of the treaty was the Growth and Stability Pact, which established the requirements that nations must meet in order to enter and maintain membership in the euro. There were two key criteria. The first was a country must maintain a budget deficit of less than 3% of gross domestic product. The second of which is the nations must maintain an inflation rate of 2% or less. Now, there were several doubts as to whether this union would ever work, and I will discuss in the next couple slides what these doubts were and how they would contribute to the sovereign debt crisis in the future. The first of these doubts was outlined by Robert Mundell in his 1961 publication called A Theory of Optimal Currency Areas. Now, what Mundell established was an optimum currency area was one in which multiple nations and states could combine together to form a single currency, despite not being backed by a single government. Now, there are several prerequisites that Mundell outlined in this journal. The first was the free movement of capital and labor across borders. Now, this is something that Europe struggled with. Their nations were defined by deep-rooted cultural differences that were a result of multiple world wars and authoritative governments that were very destructive over the past decades. Now, this prevented labor from moving across borders as citizens did not want to travel to work in different nations because of these cultural differences, and language barriers played a role as well. Now, also, the importance of an optimum currency area was to offset what was called asymmetric shock. Now, this basically meant that in an optimum currency area, resources would automatically be allocated to the areas in which those resources were needed. This is illustrated in the United States when excess tax revenues from certain states are allocated to others that aren't quite as prosperous or are successful. So this is something that very clearly Europe did not have, and this was the number one reason why there was doubt amongst many people as to whether the euro would ever be successful. The second set of doubts that individuals had as to the potential success of the euro was created by the history and the nature of the Greek economy and government. Now, Greece was a nation that was notorious for excess spending and debt accumulation. There's stories of Greek elders that dug themselves into so much debt that they took the money back from citizens, re-stamped them at the currency for a greater value, and used this to pay off their debts. And that was just one of the examples of Greek profligacy throughout the years. Now, statistics show that Greece has run a debt deficit or a budget deficit in 50% of the years since its independence, which was far more than any other nation. The second was that they were a small agricultural and, for lack of a better word, poor nation. They did not have a major industry with which to rely on, and they did not have consistent exports. Their major industries were tourism and shipping, which were hardly reliable and hardly very prosperous for that nation. The third was they were unable to modernize throughout the years. Now, there are several reasons for this. The lack of consistent industry was certainly one of them, but Greece had also been set back by a series of terrible governments that proposed austerity measures and and state-controlled regulation when the rest of the European economies were booming as a result of a free market approach. And this really set them back as they tried to modernize and tried to develop over the years. So in summary, there are very stark contrasts between that of the Greek economy and that of the northern nations such as Germany, France, and the Netherlands, who were very industrial, very prosperous, and did a great job at managing their budget and spending. Despite these doubts, Greece actually entered the euro in 2001. Now, there were several consequences of this, not just for Greece, but for Europe as well. On the first day Greek debt was traded on the markets, January 3rd, 2001, 2.7 billion euros of Greek debt was purchased by investors. Now, this is an important statistic. When it entered the euro, Greece had access to essentially free money. Their debt was being traded at interest rates that were very, very close to that of Germany and France and the Netherlands, who are obviously much more prosperous nations, much more stable economies, and they were obviously nations that were much more reliable in terms of paying back the debt that they were issued. Now, Greece undertook this debt, and it began to pile on. There were several reasons why Greece was so much worse off by this additional debt they were taking off than the other euro area peripheral nations. The first of this was the corruption that took place in their government. It was estimated that up to $30 billion was lost per year, just based off missing tax revenue alone, and 13% of Greek citizens admitted to taking bribes and lying on their taxes, essentially, misreporting incomes and things like that. So the second was inefficient industries. Now, Greece, as I mentioned before, did not have many booming industries. There were several industries. However, that they actually incurred losses on. Now, the railroad industry was one. There was estimates that it would be cheaper for the Greek government to pay for all their citizens to take cabs to get to their destinations than it would be to just keep the railroad running. When you factor in, these overpaid employees, the fact that they were way overstaffed, and that Greek citizens just weren't riding the railroads, it resulted in strenuous losses for them. And this was only one example. The third was the inefficient pension system that the Greeks had. Now, Greek citizens, once they retired, earned 96% of what they earned while they were actually working, which is much higher than any nation. Also, the Greek retirement age was only 58, which was also much higher in other nations, and was actually reducing. It was coming down, the retirement age. Now, the other thing that is almost laughable is there are several occupations that the Greek government considered to be extraneous and allowed you to retire even earlier than usual. Among these occupations were hairdressers and car washers. Now, it was obvious that the Greeks not only were taking on massive amounts of debt as a result from these debt issuance at these low interest rates to investors, but they were also losing revenue as a result of their poor tax management, poor fiscal policy, and inability to run inefficient industries and a pension system. Now, not all of the blame was that of Greece. All of the peripheral euro area nations undertook a ton of debt when they were introduced into the euro. This included Spain, Ireland, Portugal, and Italy. Now, these nations, they took on a lot of debt while they didn't really produce anything extra. Their productivity was stagnant, even though output went up just because they were consuming or taking in so much more money and spending was going up. But these statistics were misleading. Consumer indebtedness skyrocketed as a result to easy money, and it was just these countries. Upon first look, you would think that these countries are booming and their economies were actually prosperous when they weren't. It was just a misleading statistic, basically as a result of the massive amounts of debt they were taking on. Also, the European Monetary Union, which was that formed the euro and governed the euro, along with the European Central Bank, may have contributed to this problem as well by encouraging these nations to take on this debt. The main selling point, I guess, of bringing these nations into the euro was the fact that they would have access to debt at low interest rates. And this is something these economies had never seen before, these countries had never seen before, just because they weren't valued, or their risk was so much higher with investors. Once they were brought into the union with Germany and France and these other more stable nations, their debt was considered to be substantially less risky, thus lower interest rates. And this is one of the main reasons why these countries entered. And the third, somewhat surprisingly, was Germany's contribution. Now, Germany was kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum of these peripheral euro area nations. They were saving money, exporting tons and tons of goods, and saving money by not importing from these peripheral nations that were struggling.